The morning sun had barely risen when Sarah Henderson rushed through the sliding doors of Atlanta International Airport. Her heels clicked sharply against the polished floor as she pulled her wheeled suitcase behind her, constantly glancing at her watch. It was 6:45 a.m., and her flight to Chicago was scheduled to depart at 7:30 a.m. Every second mattered. As a senior marketing executive at Turner & Brooks Consulting, Sarah had built a career on her meticulous preparation and unwavering professionalism. She wasn't the kind of person to cut things this close. Her navy blue business suit was immaculate, her blonde hair tied back in a sleek bun, and her pearls rested perfectly around her neck. To anyone else she appeared as composed as ever, but inside, Sarah's anxiety churned. The morning had gone disastrously wrong from the start. Her alarm had failed to go off, her car service had sent a driver unfamiliar with the area, and now she was rushing through the airport, hoping to avoid the catastrophe of missing her flight. This flight was not just any flight, it was a lifeline to her career. The quarterly board presentation in Chicago was non-negotiable. It wasn't something she could attend virtually or reschedule without serious professional consequences. Missing it simply wasn't an option. As she approached the security checkpoint, Sarah's nerves frayed even further. The TSA line was longer than expected, and when she finally reached the agent, they scrutinized her ID for what felt like an eternity. Of all days, she muttered under her breath, tapping her foot impatiently as the agent finally waved her through. Clearing security, Sarah sped toward Gate B15, her carry-on bag trailing noisily behind her. The gate area was already crowded with early morning travelers. Some were slouched uncomfortably in seats, others were typing away furiously on laptops, and a few small children darted between chairs as their exhausted parents tried in vain to corral them. Sarah scanned the area, her eyes searching for an empty seat. Near the gate counter she spotted one, a small reprieve amid the chaos. Relief washed over her as she hurried toward it, her heels clicking in rhythm with her brisk steps. She could finally sit, regroup and review her presentation one last time. But as Sarah approached the seat, she noticed the man sitting next to it. He wore a crisp pilot's uniform, complete with shiny black shoes and a captain's hat resting neatly on his knee. He was absorbed in something on his iPad, his posture radiating calm professionalism. Everything about him seemed composed, capable, and assured. And yet Sarah hesitated. The man was black. For a moment, Sarah froze, her upbringing and ingrained biases bubbling to the surface. She had grown up in a small, predominantly white town where diversity was more of a theoretical concept than a lived experience. While her years in the corporate world had exposed her to different cultures and perspectives, old habits and deeply rooted prejudices were not so easily undone. The empty seat now seemed less inviting. Sarah's gaze darted around the gate area, searching for another option. But the place was packed. A young mother with a crying baby had just claimed the last available seat in the far corner. Her internal conflict was visible in the way she stood there, shifting awkwardly from one foot to the other. Her feet ached from standing in heels since early morning, and her laptop bag seemed to grow heavier by the second. Despite the discomfort, something kept her from sitting down next to the pilot. The man briefly glanced up from his iPad, offering Sarah a polite, professional smile before returning to his reading. It was a simple gesture, one meant to be cordial, but it only made Sarah's discomfort intensify. She turned abruptly and walked toward the gate counter. The gate agent, a middle-aged woman named Patricia, according to her neatly pinned name tag, looked up as Sarah approached. Her expression was neutral, but her years of experience in the airline industry allowed her to quickly read the subtext of most interactions. "Excuse me," Sarah began, leaning closer to speak quietly, her voice low and hesitant. "I was wondering if there might be any other seats available on the flight. I'd like to request a seat change." Patricia paused for a moment, her sharp eyes flickering to the packed gate area before meeting Sarah's gaze. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she replied evenly. "The flight is completely full. We're actually overbooked by 2 passengers." Sarah pressed on, her voice dropping even lower. "Perhaps in business class? I'd be happy to pay for an upgrade." Her eyes darted briefly toward the pilot, who remained focused on his iPad. Though his expression was calm, there was a subtle tension in his shoulders. He had overheard Sarah's request. Patricia's tone grew firmer. "As I mentioned, ma'am, the flight is completely full in all sections." Her words were polite, but her expression conveyed that the conversation was over. Flustered and defeated, Sarah returned to the empty seat. Her movements were stiff as she sat down, pulling out her laptop and opening it with exaggerated focus. She stared at the screen, pretending to work, though she couldn't seem to string together a coherent thought. Beside her, the pilot continued reading his iPad, neither acknowledging the other. As the minutes ticked by, the boarding announcement finally crackled over the speakers at Gate B15. Patricia's voice, calm and professional, called for first-class passengers to begin boarding. Sarah remained in her seat, her eyes fixed on her laptop screen, even though she hadn't typed a single word in the last 15 minutes. Next to her, the pilot closed his iPad and rose from his seat. He adjusted his uniform with practiced precision, slipping his captain's hat onto his head. Captain Marcus Williams had seen this kind of behavior many times before. In his 15 years as a commercial pilot, he had experienced every variation of prejudice imaginable. Passengers had requested seat changes upon learning he was flying the plane, expressed visible surprise during pre-flight announcements when he introduced himself, and even asked if there was another pilot on duty. None of it shocked him anymore. Still, each instance carried its own sting. As Marcus walked toward the boarding gate, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. His path to becoming a pilot had been anything but easy. He thought of his father's words from years ago, "Son, you'll have to be twice as good to get half the respect." Those words had stayed with him, fueling his determination through flight school, grueling training programs and countless hours in the cockpit. They had bolstered him on days when doubt crept in or when the looks and whispers of others weighed heavy on his spirit. Yet for every challenge there were triumphs. Marcus knew he was a skilled pilot. He knew his role demanded respect, even if it wasn't freely given. As the boarding process continued, Marcus entered the jet bridge, his stride confident and assured. Behind him, Sarah sat silently watching him go. She couldn't shake the nagging discomfort she felt, nor the growing realization that it stemmed entirely from her own biases. The rest of the passengers soon began filing onto the plane, each step bringing Sarah closer to an encounter she would remember for a long time. The morning sun had barely risen when Sarah Henderson rushed into Atlanta International Airport, desperate to make her flight to Chicago. Everything about her morning had gone wrong, from a failed alarm clock to a car service fiasco that had her arriving later than planned. Now she was navigating the bustling airport in her heels, pulling a suitcase behind her as the seconds ticked closer to the boarding call. Sarah prided herself on her professionalism and meticulous planning. As a senior marketing executive at Turner & Brooks Consulting, she was known for being prepared and composed. Missing this flight would be catastrophic. It was the only way she could make it to Chicago in time for the quarterly presentation to the board. Her career hinged on her performance today, and the stakes couldn't be higher. After clearing the TSA checkpoint, Sarah hurried toward Gate B15. Despite the chaos of travelers crowding the area, she managed to find an empty seat near the gate counter. As she approached, she noticed the man sitting next to it, dressed in a pilot's uniform. Something about his calm demeanor caught her attention. He seemed experienced and professional, but one detail made her pause: he was black. For a moment, Sarah stood frozen, her ingrained prejudices bubbling to the surface. Growing up in a small, predominantly white town had left her with biases she hadn't fully confronted, even after years of working in a diverse corporate environment. The empty seat no longer seemed like a refuge. Her discomfort gnawed at her, irrational yet insistent. She turned away, walking to the gate agent with a plan to avoid sitting near the pilot. Leaning closer to Patricia, the agent, Sarah spoke softly, her tone laced with false sweetness. "I'm so sorry to bother you again," she began. "I get terrible anxiety while flying. Would it be possible for me to board later? I'd like to be one of the last passengers on the plane." It wasn't entirely a lie. Sarah did feel anxious, though not for the reasons she claimed. Patricia looked up from her computer, her expression neutral but sharp. "Ma'am, we have a full flight today with standby passengers waiting. I strongly recommend you board with your assigned group." Sarah's hope for an easy out crumbled. Just then she noticed the pilot walking toward the jet bridge. A flicker of relief washed over her as she assumed he must be dead-heading to another city, traveling as a passenger between assignments. But her relief evaporated when the pilot paused to exchange a friendly word with Patricia. "Weather report looks good today," he said with a confident smile. "Should be a smooth flight to Chicago." The realization hit Sarah like a wave. The man she had avoided sitting near wasn't just a pilot. He was her pilot, the one flying the plane. Her face flushed red with shame and embarrassment as the implications settled in. She felt trapped, knowing she had no choice but to board. Her group was called moments later, and she moved mechanically with the line of passengers, her mind racing. Walking down the jet bridge, Sarah's thoughts spiraled. She considered turning back, claiming illness or trying to rebook on another flight. But none of those options were feasible, not when her entire career hinged on being in Chicago today. She took a deep breath and stepped onto the plane, greeted by a smiling flight attendant. "Welcome aboard," the attendant said cheerfully. "Turn right for seats 15 and higher." Sarah nodded weakly, her voice caught in her throat. As she moved past the cockpit, she couldn't help but glance inside. Captain Marcus Williams was seated, methodically going through his pre-flight checklist with his co-pilot. His movements were confident and precise, the mark of someone who had done this thousands of times. Sarah's heart sank further as she noticed passengers she'd seen at the gate already seated. Some threw her knowing looks, their expressions a mix of judgment and disapproval. An elderly woman shook her head slightly, making Sarah feel even smaller. She finally reached her seat, 17C, and stowed her bag, sinking into her chair with a heavy sigh. From her seat, she could hear Captain Williams's voice as he discussed weather conditions with air traffic control. His tone was clear, professional, and calm, exactly what she would have wanted from any pilot. Across the aisle, a young girl tugged on her mother's sleeve and pointed toward the cockpit. "Mommy, look. The pilot looks like Daddy," she said, her voice filled with excitement. The mother smiled proudly, patting her daughter's hand. Sarah, however, felt herself shrinking further into her seat. The weight of her earlier behavior bore down on her, a heavy mix of shame and guilt. She avoided eye contact with the passengers around her, pulling out her phone to distract herself. But the screen went dark within minutes. She hadn't even opened an app. The boarding process continued, with passengers chatting and settling into their seats. A flight attendant named James stopped near Sarah's row, his trained eye catching her unusually stiff posture and pale complexion. "Ma'am, are you feeling all right? Can I get you some water before takeoff?" he asked kindly. Sarah forced a weak smile and shook her head. The last thing she wanted was to draw more attention to herself. James nodded, moving on, but his genuine concern only deepened Sarah's feelings of guilt. Here was another person simply doing their job who likely faced the kind of bias she had displayed at the gate. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, and the familiar chime of the intercom filled the plane. Sarah's stomach knotted as she braced herself for what she knew was coming. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen," a voice said, clear and authoritative. "This is Captain Marcus Williams speaking from the flight deck. Welcome aboard Flight 2174 to Chicago O'Hare. Our flight time today will be approximately 2 hours and 15 minutes. Several passengers nodded approvingly, and a businessman across the aisle commented, "Always nice to have a pilot who communicates clearly." Sarah felt her cheeks burn. Captain Williams continued, describing their route and mentioning some light turbulence over Tennessee. He signed off with a confident assurance that he and his co-pilot would do their best to ensure a smooth flight. As the safety demonstration began, Sarah noticed a young black girl sitting a few rows ahead. She beamed with pride after hearing Captain Williams's announcement, eagerly telling her mother, "I want to be a pilot too, just like him." Her mother smiled, encouraging her daughter's dream. Sarah's guilt deepened. She saw the pride and inspiration Captain Williams had sparked in others, and it highlighted her own prejudice even more starkly. She had judged him unfairly, reduced his years of expertise and professionalism to a baseless assumption. The plane began to push back from the gate, and Sarah gripped her armrests tightly, not from a fear of flying, but from the weight of the lesson she was beginning to learn. In this moment, Sarah Henderson, always so confident and composed, felt small. But she also felt the faint stirrings of something new, a recognition that it wasn't too late to change. As the plane's engines hummed to life and the aircraft taxied toward the runway, Sarah Henderson sat stiffly in her seat, her hands gripping the armrests. She wasn't afraid of flying, not exactly. What weighed on her now was something far more unsettling, the realization of how her own prejudices had shaped her actions that morning. The man she had judged at the gate, based solely on his race, was now at the controls of the plane, a highly skilled professional holding not just her safety but the safety of everyone aboard in his hands. Out the window, Sarah watched as ground crew members waved their illuminated batons, guiding the massive jetliner into position. The plane responded smoothly to their signals, a testament to the coordination between the team on the ground and the experts in the cockpit. The engines roared softly, their power reverberating through the cabin as the plane edged closer to the runway. Snippets of conversation filtered through the cabin, breaking through Sarah's internal turmoil. A flight attendant was chatting with a passenger a few rows ahead. "Oh, you're lucky to have Captain Williams today," the attendant said cheerfully. "He's one of the best pilots in the fleet. Did you know he's a former Air Force pilot?" Served for over a decade before joining the airline. Each word felt like a dart to Sarah's conscience. The man she had avoided sitting next to wasn't just an accomplished pilot. He was a veteran who had served his country, honed his skills through years of rigorous training, and earned the trust of his airline and passengers alike. And she, with her polished business suit and air of authority, had reduced him to an unfair assumption in the span of a few seconds. "Flight attendants, please prepare for takeoff." Captain Williams' voice came over the intercom, steady and professional, showing no sign of whatever thoughts he might have about the earlier interaction at the gate. Sarah felt a pang of regret. While he had conducted himself with dignity and composure, she had let her own biases dictate her behavior in the worst possible way. As the engines roared to full power and the plane began its takeoff roll, Sarah closed her eyes, not from fear of flying but from the heavy weight of her own self-awareness. The aircraft lifted gracefully into the sky, banking gently toward Chicago. The smooth ascent was a physical reminder of the skill and precision of the man she had doubted. The fasten seatbelt sign chimed off once the plane reached cruising altitude, but Sarah remained firmly in her seat, lost in thought. Around her, the cabin was lively, passengers pulling out laptops, chatting, or settling in for the journey. But Sarah's mind stayed on Captain Williams, and the series of realizations that had been unfolding since she first saw him. The first hint of turbulence caused the plane to shudder lightly, prompting a few nervous glances from passengers. Right on cue, Captain Williams addressed the cabin through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, as mentioned during our takeoff, we're encountering some light turbulence over Tennessee. Nothing to be concerned about. Please keep your seatbelts fastened while seated." His calm, measured tone rippled through the cabin, soothing the nerves of the passengers. Across the aisle, a mother leaned over to reassure her anxious child. "See? Captain Williams says it's okay. He knows what he's doing." Sarah swallowed hard, the woman's words resonating deeply. Here was a man who had likely faced the weight of prejudice countless times, yet he maintained the professionalism and composure to put hundreds of strangers at ease. She couldn't help but compare his dignity to her own behavior earlier in the day. "Would you like something to drink, ma'am? Coffee, water, or juice perhaps?" The flight attendant from earlier, James, had stopped by her row, his expression friendly. This time, Sarah accepted a cup of water. Her throat felt parched, not from thirst but from the strain of her spiraling emotions. As James handed her the cup, he smiled and said, "You know, we're lucky today. Captain Williams is known for finding the smoothest routes through rough weather. I've been flying with him for 3 years now, best captain in the fleet." Sarah managed a weak smile, but the weight of his words pressed heavily on her. James wasn't just making small talk. His admiration for the captain was genuine, rooted in years of working alongside him. A conversation from a few rows ahead caught Sarah's attention. Two off-duty pilots were discussing Captain Williams' recent achievement, recounting how he had safely landed a plane during a severe storm last month when several other flights had been diverted. Another patch of turbulence rattled the plane slightly, though the movement was minimal. True to his reputation, Captain Williams had already adjusted the altitude, seeking the smoothest air. Once again his voice filled the cabin. "Folks, we've adjusted our altitude slightly to avoid the worst of the bumps. We should have smoother air for the rest of our journey to Chicago." A businessman across the aisle closed his laptop and turned to his seatmate, his voice carrying just enough to reach Sarah's ears. "You know what I love about flying? In the air, the only things that matter are skill and experience. Mother Nature doesn't care about race, gender, or anything else. Only if you can fly the plane." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She remembered her own thoughts at the gate just hours earlier, how she had let prejudice cloud her judgment of a man whose skill and experience were now ensuring her safety. The irony was undeniable. The very person she had doubted was now the one guiding the plane steadily toward its destination. As the flight attendants began their service, the comforting aroma of coffee wafted through the cabin. Through the slightly open cockpit door, Sarah glimpsed Captain Williams' hands on the controls, making small, precise adjustments with the ease of someone who had mastered their craft. The young black girl Sarah had noticed earlier walked past her seat on her way to the bathroom, proudly wearing a pilot's wings pin that James had given her. The child's eyes sparkled with inspiration, and Sarah couldn't help but wonder if she had overheard Captain Williams' announcements. It was clear that this girl saw herself in him, and the thought filled Sarah with a bittersweet mix of guilt and admiration. An hour into the flight, dark clouds loomed ahead, signaling the possibility of more turbulence. Several passengers who had been sleeping or working glanced nervously out the windows. Sarah could feel the tension building, but before it could take hold, Captain Williams' voice came through the speakers once more. "This is Captain Williams speaking. We're approaching an area of weather that's developed along our route. I've requested a slight course adjustment from air traffic control to avoid the worst of it. My first officer and I are monitoring the situation closely." His calm authority seemed to settle the cabin. Even a crying baby a few rows ahead quieted as the captain's voice reassured the passengers. Sarah thought about how many times Captain Williams must have handled situations like this, managing not just the physical safety of his passengers but also their emotional comfort. All the while he had likely endured the weight of biases like hers, perhaps daily. The realization was humbling. Sarah sank deeper into her seat, feeling the full force of her earlier behavior. Captain Williams had shown grace and professionalism throughout, embodying the very qualities she admired in others. And yet she had doubted him. The lesson was undeniable. The turbulence she was experiencing was entirely her own, and it had nothing to do with the weather. James, the flight attendant, moved swiftly down the aisle, securing loose items and checking on passengers as the plane gently shifted course to avoid the approaching storm. When he passed Sarah's seat, he paused and smiled knowingly. "Classic Captain Williams," he said with a hint of admiration in his voice. "Always thinking 3 steps ahead. Some pilots might push straight through a storm but not him. He'll find the smoothest way every time." Sarah barely managed a nod in response, her thoughts swirling. She glanced out the window and saw the evidence of James's words. The aircraft began a slow, deliberate turn, banking gracefully away from the darkest, most ominous clouds. Trails from other planes ahead disappeared into the heart of the storm, their paths direct and turbulent. In contrast, their jet maintained a smooth arc around the edges of the weather system, a testament to the skill and foresight of the captain at the helm. Behind her, a deep voice rose above the hum of the engines. "I've been flying this route every week for 3 years, a man in a business suit said to his seatmate. "Had all kinds of pilots in that time, but you can always tell the experienced ones. This captain? He's got the touch. Smoothest flight I've had in months." The words settled heavily in Sarah's mind. Her laptop, which she'd opened earlier to prepare for her upcoming presentation, now sat untouched on the tray table. She stared at the screen, but the text blurred as her focus drifted elsewhere. That presentation, so crucial just hours ago, now felt inconsequential compared to the lesson unfolding around her at 36,000 feet. How many other snap judgments had she made in her life? How many talented, capable people had she dismissed without knowing anything about them? The thought made her stomach turn. The plane jolted slightly and Captain Williams's calm voice came over the intercom. "Folks, we've coordinated with Chicago Approach Control to adjust our arrival route slightly. This will add about 10 minutes to our flight time, but it should give us a much smoother ride. I appreciate your patience." In the row near the emergency exit, 2 off-duty pilots nodded approvingly at his announcement. One leaned toward the other and murmured, "That's why Williams has the highest safety rating in the company. He never takes unnecessary risks, always prioritizes passenger comfort." Sarah's gaze drifted toward the young black girl she had noticed earlier, now sitting quietly with her mother. The child was deeply engrossed in her notebook, sketching airplanes with a pilot's wings pin prominently displayed on her chest. Sarah caught snippets of the mother's gentle words. She was explaining to her daughter how Captain Williams had started his career as a military pilot, flying cargo planes in dangerous conditions before transitioning to commercial aviation. The pride in her voice was unmistakable, and Sarah found herself captivated. Each new detail about the captain's life chipped away further at the shame she felt over her earlier assumptions. Rain streaked softly against the windows as the aircraft skimmed the edge of the storm. Despite the occasional light turbulence, the flight remained remarkably steady. Through the cockpit door, left slightly ajar, Sarah could see Captain Williams and his first officer working in perfect harmony, their hands moving deftly across the controls. Each motion was precise and practiced, the result of years of experience. Across the aisle, an elderly woman was leaning toward her grandson. Her voice carried a warm, soothing quality. "I've always been afraid of flying," she said softly, patting his hand. "But not today. There's something about this pilot, the way he explains everything so clearly. It's like he knows how to make you feel safe." Her grandson nodded, his eyes wide with wonder, as though Captain Williams's calm confidence had reached even him. The plane finally broke free of the storm's grasp, and sunlight spilled through the cabin windows, casting everything in a golden glow. Spontaneously, a ripple of applause broke out among the passengers, a collective expression of gratitude for the captain's skillful navigation. Sarah found herself clapping too, her hands moving instinctively. Her eyes filled with tears, not from fear nor from relief, but from a deep and humbling realization. She had judged Captain Williams harshly and unfairly before she even knew his name, let alone his capabilities. James passed through the cabin once more, checking on passengers and sharing updates. "We'll be starting our descent into Chicago in about 20 minutes, he announced, his voice cheerful. "Captain Williams has already received clearance for our approach. The weather at O'Hare is clear, so it should be a smooth landing." Glancing at her watch, Sarah realized she would still make her meeting on time, a meeting that had driven her urgency that morning, clouding her judgment. The irony stung. The very man she had doubted had not only ensured her safety but also preserved the integrity of her schedule. She leaned back in her seat, her thoughts consumed by a single resolution. She couldn't undo her earlier actions, but she could confront them. When they landed, she would wait to speak with Captain Williams. She owed him an apology, and perhaps more importantly, she owed herself an honest reckoning with her own biases. As the Chicago skyline came into view, the plane began its final descent. Passengers around her adjusted their seats and fastened their seatbelts, the cabin coming to life with the familiar sounds of landing preparations. Sarah looked out her window, watching the city below grow larger with each passing moment. Sunlight glinted off Lake Michigan, painting the scene in soft hues of blue and gold. "This is Captain Williams," his familiar voice echoed through the cabin. "We're beginning our final approach into Chicago O'Hare. Current weather shows crosswinds at 15 knots, but nothing that should concern you. Please ensure your seats are upright, and your seatbelts are securely fastened." The businesswoman next to Sarah leaned toward her colleague, her tone tinged with skepticism. "I've landed in Chicago during much worse conditions. These crosswinds can make for a rough landing. Let's see how this captain handles it." The challenge in her voice irked Sarah, though she said nothing. Instead, she focused on the window as the plane descended smoothly through scattered clouds. Other aircraft in the distance bounced visibly in the wind, their paths turbulent and shaky. In contrast, their plane seemed almost to glide, its movements graceful and steady. Sarah could feel the subtle adjustments as Captain Williams skillfully compensated for the wind, guiding the plane with precision. James moved quietly down the aisle one last time, offering reassurance to a nervous passenger. "Captain Williams is known for his crosswind landings," he said with a smile. "In fact, he teaches other pilots how to handle conditions like these. You're in good hands." Ahead of her, the young girl who had been sketching airplanes was now pressed against the window, her excitement palpable. "Mommy, look how smooth it is," she exclaimed. "It's like we're floating." Her mother's proud smile said everything. As the runway came into view, Sarah listened to the calm, measured exchanges between Captain Williams and air traffic control, audible through the open cockpit door. Each word was deliberate, his professionalism unwavering. Even the off-duty pilots nearby seemed to be paying close attention, nodding appreciatively at the captain's precise commands. The plane made its final adjustments, banking slightly to align perfectly with the runway. When the wheels touched down, the landing was so smooth that many passengers didn't realize they had already arrived. A collective sigh of relief filled the cabin, followed by another round of applause. For Sarah, the moment was transformative. Captain Williams had proven, through action and expertise, everything she had been too blind to see at first. As the plane taxied toward the gate, she resolved to stand and wait, not to rush to her meeting but to thank the man who had quietly taught her one of the most important lessons of her life. As the aircraft approached the runway, Captain Williams's voice came through the intercom one final time. His calm, steady tone was a reassuring constant. "Flight attendants, prepare for landing," he instructed. The plane descended with remarkable stability despite the reported crosswinds, a testament to the thousands of hours of training and experience that had gone into making such a challenging maneuver appear effortless. Sarah watched through the window, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She could see the paths of other planes ahead of them, their approaches visibly affected by the wind. In contrast, their aircraft remained unwavering, gliding smoothly toward the runway. The passengers around her seemed unusually relaxed for this phase of the flight. Sarah realized how different this atmosphere was compared to other landings, which were often filled with nervous tension. Even the baby who had been crying earlier had fallen silent, now peacefully asleep. The ground drew closer, and Sarah braced for the usual bump of touchdown. Instead, the massive aircraft seemed to kiss the runway, the landing so gentle that many passengers appeared surprised. A wave of spontaneous applause broke out in the cabin. "Now that's a landing," exclaimed the businessman seated across the aisle. In 30 years of flying into Chicago, I've never had one this smooth in conditions like these. The plane slowed as it taxied toward the gate, and Captain Williams's voice returned, warm and composed. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Chicago O'Hare International Airport. The local time is 9:45 a.m., and the temperature is 68 degrees Fahrenheit. We know you have a choice when you fly, and we sincerely appreciate you choosing us for your journey today. On behalf of the entire crew, we wish you a pleasant stay in Chicago or safe travels to your final destination. As passengers began unbuckling their seatbelts and gathering their belongings, Sarah overheard snippets of conversation. "Did you feel that landing?" "Perfect," one passenger said. "Who was the captain today?" another asked. "I need to remember his name." "Best flight I've had into Chicago in years." The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. Hours earlier, she had refused to sit next to Captain Williams in the gate area, judging him based on his appearance. Yet now he had demonstrated a level of professionalism, skill and care that made her own actions seem trivial and shameful. Every moment of the flight had been an unspoken rebuttal to her prejudices. As the plane came to a stop and the seatbelt sign chimed off, Sarah remained seated. Her heart pounded as she clutched her laptop bag, watching the other passengers shuffle out. Her decision was made, she would wait to speak with Captain Williams. Not only to apologize but also to thank him for the safe flight and the profound lesson he had taught her. She wasn't sure how he would react, but she knew she couldn't leave without saying something. James, the flight attendant, noticed her lingering as the cabin emptied. He approached with a gentle smile. "Everything all right, ma'am? Do you need help with your bags?" Sarah shook her head, managing a small nervous smile in return. "No thank you. I'm actually waiting to speak with Captain Williams." Something in James's expression shifted, his smile softening with understanding. He had likely noticed her behavior at the gate and perhaps had even overheard her remarks. Yet there was no judgment in his eyes, only quiet approval at her intent to make things right. Nearby, the young black girl and her mother were among the last to leave. The girl proudly displayed her pilot's wings pin one final time. "I'm going to be just like Captain Williams someday," she announced, her voice filled with certainty. Her mother smiled warmly, then paused as they passed Sarah. She looked directly at her, her gaze calm yet knowing. "It's never too late to learn and grow," she said softly before leading her daughter off the plane. Those words lingered in Sarah's mind as she sat in the now empty cabin, the hum of post-flight activity filling the air. Cleaning crews began boarding, mechanics inspected the exterior, and printers in the galley whirred, spitting out flight logs. Even as the bustle of routine surrounded her, Sarah felt as if she were in a bubble, the significance of her decision outweighing the noise around her. Finally she stood, her legs shaky, and walked toward the cockpit. Through the open door she could see Captain Williams and his first officer, Chin, meticulously going through their post-flight checklist. Their movements were precise and coordinated, the same professionalism evident in every step of their work. Sarah hesitated, unsure of how to interrupt, but eventually stepped closer and waited in the galley. First Officer Chen was the first to notice her. He nodded politely as he exited the cockpit, offering her a small smile before disappearing into the terminal. Captain Williams followed shortly after, his captain's hat tucked under one arm. He noticed Sarah standing there and paused, his expression neutral but approachable. "Captain Williams," Sarah began, her voice trembling slightly. I need to apologize to you." She felt her cheeks flush with heat and tears pricked the corners of her eyes. Forcing herself to push past the lump in her throat, she continued. "My behavior at the gate was inexcusable. I let prejudice cloud my judgment, and I'm deeply ashamed of how I acted. Your skill, your professionalism, your care for everyone on this flight. It was extraordinary. And she faltered, wiping a tear from her cheek. "I was so wrong." Captain Williams stood quietly, listening with an expression that betrayed no hint of judgment or frustration. Around them, the hum of activity continued, but Sarah felt as though the moment existed solely between them. When she finished, the captain's face softened slightly. His voice, steady and kind, carried the same calm authority it had during the flight. "Miss Henderson," he began, surprising her by remembering her name from the passenger manifest. "I've been flying for 15 years. What you did at the gate, unfortunately it's not uncommon." His words hit Sarah like a blow, not out of anger but because of the truth they carried. She had been part of a broader problem, one that extended far beyond her own actions. Tears streamed down her face now, but Captain Williams didn't seem to judge her for them. "But," he continued, his voice gentler now, "what is uncommon is someone taking the time to reflect, acknowledge their mistake and try to make it right. That takes courage. Sarah blinked, his response catching her off guard. She had expected frustration or perhaps even dismissal, but his grace in the face of her admission left her speechless. I didn't become a pilot to prove anything to anyone, he said after a pause. I did it because I love flying and because I want to ensure every passenger who steps onto my plane feels safe. That's what matters most to me. His words carried no bitterness, only a quiet strength that made Sarah's shame feel almost unbearable. Thank you, she whispered, her voice breaking. For the flight, for your professionalism, and for this? Captain Williams nodded, a faint smile playing on his lips. Safe travels, Miss Henderson. And thank you for taking the time to speak with me. As Sarah left the plane, she felt lighter, though the weight of her lesson would stay with her. In Captain Williams's quiet grace, she had seen not only the professional she had wronged but also the person she wanted to become. Captain Marcus Williams adjusted the sleeve of his uniform thoughtfully, his hand pausing on the cuff as he considered his next words. His calm and composed demeanor was the same one that had guided him through the turbulent weather of the flight just hours before. Now, standing in the galley with Sarah, he continued, his voice steady and unhurried. What you're doing right now, acknowledging your mistake, taking responsibility for your actions, that is uncommon and it matters. Sarah's tears flowed freely now, her emotions raw as she absorbed his words. She had come to him seeking an apology for the prejudices she had carried with her, but in doing so, she had learned a lesson she hadn't expected. Captain Williams, with his patient and measured response, had shown her more about growth and integrity than she had realized was possible. Seeing Sarah struggle, Captain Williams reached into his pocket and pulled out a tissue, offering it to her with the same professional courtesy he had shown throughout the entire flight. He stood there, allowing her the space to collect herself. There was no rush in his movements, no impatience with her vulnerability. It was clear he had been in situations where judgment had been passed on him, but he handled it with a quiet strength. You know, he began, glancing briefly toward the cockpit before turning his focus back to Sarah. When I was 10 years old, someone told me a black man could never be an airline captain. That there were doors in life that would always remain closed to me. He paused, a small smile crossing his face as he recalled the memory. But here I am, 20,000 flight hours later. His words held no bitterness, only the weight of experience. There was no denying the challenges he had faced along the way, nor the barriers that had stood in his path. Yet, with each word he spoke, he demonstrated that those obstacles had only fueled his determination. Sarah, still holding the tissue he had given her, dabbed at her eyes and asked quietly, "How do you handle it? People like me making assumptions, judging you before knowing anything about you?" Captain Williams straightened his tie, a small but deliberate gesture that seemed to give him a moment of reflection. His answer came slowly, thoughtfully, as if he had rehearsed it over the years, yet it still carried the weight of sincerity. By being exactly who I am. A pilot who loves his job and does it to the best of his ability. Every safe landing, every smooth flight through rough weather, every professional interaction. They all speak louder than any prejudice ever could. His words landed with the quiet power of someone who had lived through the very judgment he described. Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of humility wash over her. In that moment, she realized the vast difference between how she had viewed him at the gate and the man standing before her now. The captain's professionalism was not just a skill, it was a reflection of his character. Before Sarah could respond, James appeared in the galley doorway. "Captain, your next flight crew is starting their pre-flight checks," he said gently, his tone a subtle reminder that time was running short. Captain Williams acknowledged the interruption with a nod, but raised one finger, asking for just a moment longer. He turned back to Sarah, who was still clutching the tissue and holding her presentation folder in her other hand. "Before you go," he said, reaching into his flight bag. "I want to show you something." From the bag, he pulled out a worn photograph and handed it to Sarah. The picture showed a much younger version of himself, standing proudly in front of a small training aircraft, his father's arm around his shoulders. "That's my first solo flight," he explained, his voice warm with the memory. "My father worked 2 jobs to help pay for my flight training. He told me that day that excellence is the best answer to prejudice. I've lived by those words ever since." Sarah studied the photograph in her hands. The young Marcus Williams in the picture looked determined, confident even at such a young age. The determination that had carried him from those humble beginnings to the cockpit of a commercial airliner was evident in his eyes, an expression she had witnessed just hours before in the way he handled the flight. Her voice was soft when she returned the photo to him. "Your father must be very proud." Captain Williams smiled, a hint of nostalgia in his expression. "He is," he said, his tone shifting slightly. "But you know what makes him even prouder? When people learn and grow from their experiences." He gestured toward the window where the young black girl who had wanted to be a pilot was still visible, walking through the terminal with her mother. Sarah couldn't help but notice how the girl's face glowed with the same excitement she herself had felt as a child when she first dreamed of flying. Every time someone moves past their prejudices, another door opens for kids like her, Captain Williams continued. Sarah thought about her own daughter back home. The realization struck her like a lightning bolt. She had been teaching her daughter the wrong things without even realizing it, not through words but through actions. She had been imparting biases, allowing prejudices to subtly seep into her everyday decisions. "I've been teaching her the wrong things," she admitted quietly. "Not with words but with actions. Like what I did today." Captain Williams's gaze softened, his voice kind. "Then teach her something different tomorrow." His words resonated deeply with Sarah, and for the first time she felt like she had an opportunity to correct the course she had set for her daughter. It was a profound moment of clarity. She could teach her daughter to see the world through a lens of possibility, not prejudice. Captain Williams reached into his pocket and pulled out one of his business cards. "The airline runs a program for young people interested in aviation from all backgrounds and walks of life," he said. "Maybe your daughter would like to learn what it's really about." Sarah took the card with trembling fingers, understanding the deeper meaning of his gesture. It wasn't just about aviation, it was about opening minds and hearts. It was about giving the next generation the tools to rise above the biases and limitations that had plagued her own thinking for so long. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Not just for this but for everything, the way you handled the flight, the weather, and my behavior." James appeared again, more urgently this time. "Captain, 5 minutes until pre-flight briefing," he said, a quiet reminder that Captain Williams's time was running short. Captain Williams nodded, acknowledging the urgency. He turned back to Sarah one last time. "M. Henderson," he said, his voice steady, "prejudice is like bad weather. It can make the journey rough. But with skill and patience you can fly through it to clear skies." He extended his hand. "Have a good meeting today and remember, sometimes the most important journey isn't the one that gets you from point A to point B." Sarah shook his hand firmly, noting the strength and confidence in his grip, the same steady hands that had guided them safely through the morning's flight. As she turned to leave, she noticed that the next flight's passengers had already begun to board. Among them was another young girl, clutching a toy airplane, walking through the terminal with her mother. Sarah pulled out her phone and scrolled past her presentation notes, opening her family photo album instead. She found a picture of her daughter and typed a message. "Hey sweetie, how would you like to learn about flying planes? I met someone amazing today who made me see things differently." As she sent the message, she watched from the terminal window as Captain Williams's next flight took off. His plane climbed smoothly into the sky, carrying another set of passengers who would learn, as she had, that excellence knows no color. Wisdom, as it turned out, could come from the most unexpected moments. Clutching the captain's business card in her hand, Sarah realized that today's flight had taken her on 2 journeys, one to Chicago and one toward becoming a better person. As she headed to her meeting, she understood that while her presentation was important, the most valuable lesson she had learned today had come from a pilot who had shown her how to rise above prejudice with grace, skill, and unwavering professionalism. The morning sun streamed through the terminal windows, casting long shadows behind her as she walked away, changed in ways she had never expected when she first arrived at the Atlanta airport just a few hours ago.